Picture this. You're walking through the countryside of rural England in 1928, and you stumble upon an imposing Victorian mansion shrouded in overgrown ivy and silence. The locals whisper about the place, crossing themselves as they hurry past its rusted gates. They speak of a girl who vanished into those walls decades ago, a child who became a bride at an age when she should have been playing with dolls. What they don't tell you is that she's still there, locked away in rooms that time forgot, aging in captivity while the world moves on without her. Before diving into this forgotten story of imprisonment and survival, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths behind closed doors, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these haunting stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the mysteries that history tries to bury. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of arranged marriage gone wrong. It's the story of how wealth and power can transform love into possession, childhood into bondage, and a human being into a living secret hidden from the world. The name Margaret Thornfield might not be familiar to you, but her story will haunt you long after you finish listening. Let's start with the man who would become the architect of this nightmare. Lord Edmund Blackwood wasn't born a monster. In fact, his early years suggested a promising future for one of England's most eligible bachelors. Born into one of the country's oldest noble families in 1885, he inherited not just a title, but vast estates across 3 counties, coal mines that funded his lavish lifestyle, and a reputation for charm that made him the darling of London society. When he walked into a room, conversations stopped. When he spoke, people listened. When he smiled, hearts fluttered across ballrooms from Brighton to Bath. But absolute wealth, like absolute power, has a way of corrupting even the most promising souls. And by 1925, something had fundamentally shifted inside Lord Blackwood's mind. Maybe it was the isolation that comes with being so wealthy that normal human relationships become impossible. Maybe it was the constant flattery from those who depended on his generosity for their livelihoods. Or maybe it was what happened to the one person who had ever dared to challenge his authority. Her name was Lady Catherine Ashford, and she was everything Edmund thought he wanted in a woman. Beautiful beyond description, intelligent enough to match his wit, and independent enough to intrigue him. She came from a family nearly as wealthy as his own, which meant she couldn't be bought or intimidated like the others who surrounded him. When Edmund first laid eyes on Catherine at a charity gala in 1920, he was struck not just by her beauty, but by her complete indifference to his status and fortune. Where other women giggled at his jokes and hung on his every word, Catherine treated him like any other man. She debated politics with him, challenged his opinions on literature, and even had the audacity to correct him when he misquoted Shakespeare during a dinner party. For a man accustomed to absolute deference, Catherine's independence was intoxicating. The courtship that followed was unlike anything London society had ever witnessed. Edmund pursued Catherine with the single-minded determination of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. He sent her exotic flowers flown in from distant colonies, commissioned symphonies to be written in her honor, and even purchased a minor planet from an astronomer just so he could name it after her. The newspapers called it the romance of the century, but those closest to the couple began to notice disturbing patterns in Edmund's behavior. He would fly into jealous rages if other men spoke to Catherine at social gatherings. He began stationing servants to monitor her activities when they were apart. He commissioned artists to paint her portrait dozens of times, not for public display, but for his private chambers, so he could stare at her image when she wasn't present. What the press described as romantic devotion was actually the early stages of an obsession that would consume everything in its path. Catherine, for her part, seemed initially flattered by Edmund's attention. She was 22, beautiful, and had never experienced such intense focus from a man of his caliber. But as the months passed, She began to recognize the suffocating nature of his affection. The flowers came with notes demanding to know who else had seen them. The symphonies were performed only for her, in private concerts where Edmund watched her reactions with unsettling intensity. The named planet became a symbol, not of romance but of possession, as if he had claimed a piece of the universe itself, just to own something connected to her. The engagement, when it finally came, was announced with fanfare that reached across the empire. But those who knew Catherine well noticed she seemed more resigned than joyful. The wedding preparations consumed nearly a year, with Edmund involving himself in every detail from the colour of the tablecloths to the arrangement of flowers in the church. He insisted on approving Catherine's wedding dress, her jewellery, even her hairstyle for the ceremony. What should have been the bride's choices became the groom's commands, and Catherine found herself becoming a beautifully dressed puppet in her own wedding production. The ceremony itself was a spectacle that drew royalty from across Europe. The cathedral was filled with music, the streets lined with cheering crowds, and the couple looked every inch the perfect aristocratic partnership. But those who watched closely noticed Catherine's hands trembling as she spoke her vows, and the way Edmund's grip on her arm during the ceremony left visible marks on her pale skin. The honeymoon was where the mask finally slipped completely. Edmund had purchased a private island in the Mediterranean, complete with a villa that had been modified to his exact specifications. What Catherine discovered when they arrived was that the island had no way to communicate with the outside world, no means of transportation back to the mainland, and staff who answered only to Edmund's commands. The romantic getaway was actually an elaborate prison designed to give Edmund complete control over his new wife. For 3 months, Catherine found herself trapped in paradise. The villa was beautiful, the food exquisite, and the scenery breathtaking, but she was essentially a captive audience for Edmund's increasingly erratic behaviour. He would wake her in the middle of the night to recite poetry he had written about her beauty. He followed her everywhere, never allowing her a moment of privacy. He had her portrait painted again and again, each time with subtle changes that reflected his evolving fantasy of who she should be. When they finally returned to England, Catherine was a changed woman. The independence and spirit that had first attracted Edmund were gone, replaced by a nervous compliance that worried her friends and family. She had learned that resistance only made Edmund more controlling, that arguing with him resulted in days of isolation and emotional manipulation. The vibrant woman who had once debated politics and corrected Shakespeare quotes had become a silent ornament in her husband's collection. But Catherine retained one spark of her former self, and it would prove to be her downfall. Despite Edmund's surveillance and control, she managed to begin a secret correspondence with a childhood friend who had become a journalist. The letters, hidden in books and passed through trusted servants, revealed the truth about her marriage and her growing desperation to escape. She wrote about feeling like a beautiful bird in a gilded cage, about losing herself piece by piece until she wasn't sure who she was anymore. The discovery of these letters sent Edmund into a rage that terrified even his most loyal servants. He didn't just destroy the correspondence. He had every servant who might have been involved dismissed without references, ensuring they would never find employment again. The journalist who had been Catherine's confidant was found dead in his lodgings 3 days later, officially ruled a suicide, but whispered by many to be something far more sinister. Catherine's punishment was swift and devastating. Edmund had her declared mentally unstable by a physician who owed his career to the Blackwood family fortune. The diagnosis was hysteria, brought on by the pressures of aristocratic life, and the prescribed treatment was complete isolation from society until her condition improved. Catherine was locked away in a private wing of the Blackwood estate, cut off from all contact with the outside world, and attended only by nurses who reported directly to Edmund. For 2 years, Catherine existed in this luxurious prison. She was well fed, clothed in the finest fabrics, and given books and music to occupy her time. But she was utterly alone, except for Edmund's daily visits. These sessions became elaborate theatrical performances, where Edmund would act out conversations with the woman he remembered falling in love with, while Catherine was forced to play along or face withdrawal of even her basic comforts. The isolation and constant psychological manipulation took their toll. Catherine began to lose her grip on reality, sometimes forgetting who she was or why she was imprisoned. Edmund saw this deterioration not as a tragedy, but as a success. He had finally created the perfect wife, one who existed solely for his pleasure and posed no threat to his control. But fate had one final cruel twist in store for both of them. In 1927, during one of their daily sessions, Catherine collapsed suddenly while Edmund was reading her poetry he had written about their early courtship. Palace physicians were summoned immediately, but it was too late. Catherine had suffered a massive stroke, brought on by years of stress and psychological trauma. She died in Edmund's arms, and for the first time in his life, the man who had controlled everything found himself powerless to prevent the one loss that mattered most. The funeral was a private affair, with Edmund insisting that Catherine's condition at the time of her death made a public ceremony inappropriate. The official cause was listed as complications from her mental illness, but the truth was far darker. Catherine had essentially died of despair, her body finally succumbing to the accumulated damage of years spent as a prisoner in her own home. Edmund's grief was as extreme as his love had been. He refused to allow Catherine's body to be buried, instead having it preserved and displayed in a private chapel he had constructed within the estate. He would spend hours sitting beside her casket, conducting the same one-sided conversations they had shared during her imprisonment. The servants whispered that their master had finally lost his mind completely, but none dared to intervene. It was during this period of elaborate mourning that Edmund's attention turned to someone who would become the next victim of his twisted need for control. Margaret Thornfield was the 12-year-old daughter of the estate's groundskeeper, a man who had served the Blackwood family faithfully for over 2 decades. Margaret was a bright, cheerful child who had grown up playing in the gardens of the estate, completely unaware of the dark dramas unfolding in the main house. What caught Edmund's attention wasn't Margaret's beauty, though she was certainly a lovely child. It was her resemblance to Catherine at a young age. When Edmund first noticed this similarity, something clicked in his broken mind. Here was a chance to start over, to create the perfect wife from childhood, to avoid the mistakes that had led to Catherine's rebellion and ultimate destruction. The plan that began forming in Edmund's mind was both methodical and utterly insane. He would take Margaret away from her family, educate her according to his specifications, and mould her into the ideal companion. Unlike Catherine, who had come to him with her own ideas and independence, Margaret would be shaped entirely by his influence. She would know no other world, no other expectations, no other possibilities beyond what he provided. The first step was gaining legal control over the child, and Edmund's wealth made this disturbingly easy. He approached Margaret's father with an offer that seemed too generous to refuse. He would adopt Margaret as his ward, provide her with the finest education money could buy, and ensure her a future that no groundskeeper's daughter could otherwise hope for. The paperwork was drawn up by lawyers who asked no questions, and within weeks, Margaret Thornfield had become Margaret Blackwood, though she had no understanding of what this change would mean for her life. The transformation began immediately. Margaret was moved from her family's modest cottage to a specially prepared suite in the main house. She was told that her parents had agreed she would be better served by living with Lord Blackwood, who would provide her with opportunities they never could. The 12-year-old girl was confused, but not initially frightened. She had always known Edmund as a distant but not unkind figure, and the promise of education and adventure seemed exciting rather than threatening. But Edmund's idea of education was unlike anything a normal child might receive. Margaret was assigned private tutors who had been carefully selected not just for their academic credentials, but for their willingness to follow Edmund's specific curriculum. She was taught languages, literature, music, and art, but always with a focus on becoming the perfect companion for a sophisticated man. Her reading was limited to books Edmund approved. Her music lessons focused on pieces he enjoyed, and her art instruction emphasized subjects he found beautiful. More disturbing was the way Edmund inserted himself into every aspect of Margaret's education. He would observe her lessons through hidden panels, take notes on her progress, and provide detailed feedback to her tutors about how to modify their approach. He began joining her for meals, engaging her in conversations that were simultaneously educational and subtly manipulative. He would test her knowledge, correct her opinions, and gradually shape her thoughts to align with his own preferences. As months passed, Margaret began to lose contact with the outside world entirely. Her parents were told she was thriving in her new environment and that visits would be disruptive to her studies. Her former friends from the estate were instructed to avoid the main house, and gradually Margaret's entire social circle consisted of Edmund and the carefully selected staff who attended to her needs. She was becoming isolated without realizing it, cut off from normal childhood experiences and relationships. The psychological manipulation was subtle but constant. Edmund would praise Margaret lavishly when she pleased him and withdraw his attention when she disappointed him. He created a world where his approval was the only validation that mattered, where his preferences became her preferences, and where his vision of her future became her only imaginable destiny. The bright, independent child, who had once run freely through the estate gardens, was slowly being transformed into something else entirely. By her 13th birthday, Margaret had become a strange hybrid of child and adult, educated far beyond her years in some subjects, but completely naive about the world beyond Edmund's control. She spoke 3 languages fluently, could play piano and violin beautifully, and had read more literature than most university graduates. But she had never been to a town, never spoken to children her own age, and had no concept of normal family relationships or social interactions. Edmund watched this transformation with growing satisfaction. Unlike his relationship with Catherine, which had been built on conquest and control, his relationship with Margaret was based on creation and moulding. He was crafting the perfect companion from scratch, someone who would never know enough about the world to question his authority or desire escape from his influence. But as Margaret approached her 14th birthday, Edmund began to contemplate the next phase of his plan. The child he had been shaping for nearly 2 years was beginning to show signs of the woman she would become, and his intentions for her future were becoming clearer in his own mind. What he envisioned was not just a ward or even an adopted daughter, but something far more disturbing that would lock Margaret away from the world for decades to come. The stage was set for a crime that would span generations, hidden behind the walls of a grand estate where money and power had created a world unto itself. Margaret, now approaching 15, had no idea that her carefully controlled education was preparation for a future that would steal not just her childhood, but her entire adult life. The man she had been taught to see as her benefactor was actually her captor, and the beautiful prison he had created for her was about to become permanent in ways that would shock even those who thought they understood the depths of human cruelty. The transformation of Margaret from curious child to compliant companion accelerated dramatically as she entered her 15th year. Edmund's daily interactions with her took on a different quality, shifting from paternal guidance to something that made the household staff increasingly uncomfortable. He began commenting on her appearance in ways that seemed inappropriate for a guardian speaking to his ward. He would compliment her posture, her smile, the way candlelight caught her hair during their evening conversations. Margaret, having known no other adult relationships, accepted these observations as normal expressions of care and approval. Edmund's obsession with Margaret's development extended to every aspect of her physical presentation. He hired seamstresses to create elaborate wardrobes that emphasized her emerging feminine qualities while maintaining an air of innocence that satisfied his twisted aesthetic preferences. The dresses were beautiful, but restrictive, requiring assistance to put on and remove, creating another layer of dependency that bound Margaret more tightly to the household staff, who served Edmund's interests above all else. The meals they shared became increasingly formal affairs, with Edmund teaching Margaret the intricate social protocols of high society, while simultaneously isolating her from any context where she might use these skills. He would correct her table manners with obsessive attention to detail, explaining that a lady of her station must be prepared for the finest social occasions, though no such occasions were ever planned or permitted. Margaret learned to navigate 7-course dinners with perfect etiquette, while having no understanding that most people ate simple meals in the company of families and friends. Edmund's control over Margaret's education became even more specialized as he began preparing her for what he privately called her true destiny. Her literature lessons focused increasingly on romantic poetry and novels about devoted wives who found their greatest happiness in serving their husbands' needs. Her music instruction emphasized pieces that Edmund found particularly moving, songs about eternal love and feminine devotion that he would request during their evening entertainments. Even her art lessons were directed towards subjects that pleased him, with Margaret spending hours painting portraits of flowers, landscapes, and idealized domestic scenes that matched Edmund's vision of perfect femininity. The psychological conditioning was so gradual that Margaret never recognized it as manipulation. Edmund would tell her stories about the outside world that emphasized its dangers and corruptions, painting a picture of society as a harsh place where innocent young women were constantly threatened by unscrupulous men and false friends. He described her protected life within the estate as a precious gift, a sanctuary where she could develop her natural gifts without the contamination of worldly influences. Margaret began to feel genuinely grateful for her isolation, believing that Edmund's control was actually a form of loving protection. As Margaret's 16th birthday approached, Edmund began introducing new elements into their relationship that should have alarmed anyone with normal social understanding. He started giving her jewelry that was clearly meant for a woman rather than a girl, elaborate necklaces and bracelets that he would personally fasten around her neck and wrists during their evening conversations. He began requesting that she wear particular outfits for their meals together, expressing preferences that seemed to focus more on her appearance than her comfort or appropriateness for a young woman her age. The household staff noticed these changes, but were powerless to intervene. Edmund's wealth and social position made him untouchable, and the servants understood that questioning his treatment of Margaret would result in immediate dismissal and blacklisting throughout the county. They watched in uncomfortable silence as their master's behavior toward his ward became increasingly inappropriate. But their own survival depended on maintaining the fiction that everything was normal and proper. Margaret's contact with her biological parents had been systematically eliminated through a series of carefully orchestrated deceptions. Edmund told her that her father had been promoted to manage another estate in Scotland, a position that required the family to relocate immediately. He showed her forged letters from her parents expressing their happiness with their new situation and their gratitude that Margaret was receiving such excellent care. The letters, actually written by Edmund himself, gradually decreased in frequency before stopping entirely, with Edmund explaining that her parents were too busy with their new responsibilities to maintain regular correspondence. The isolation was so complete that Margaret had no way to verify these stories or seek alternative perspectives on her situation. Her world consisted entirely of Edmund, his carefully selected staff, and the elaborate fantasy he had constructed around their relationship. She had no friends her own age, no exposure to normal family dynamics, and no understanding of what healthy relationships between adults and children should look like. Edmund had successfully created a reality where his presence was the only constant, his approval the only validation, and his vision of her future the only possibility she could imagine. On Margaret's 16th birthday, Edmund presented her with a gift that would have horrified any normal observer, but which Margaret received with the innocent pleasure of a child who had been taught to trust her guardian completely. It was a wedding dress, exquisitely crafted and clearly designed for her specific measurements. Edmund explained that he had commissioned it as a symbol of her transition from childhood to womanhood, a recognition that she was now ready to take on the responsibilities and privileges of adult life. The dress was beautiful in the way that expensive things often are, but it represented something far more sinister than a coming-of-age celebration. Edmund had been planning this moment for years, carefully preparing Margaret for a role she didn't understand and couldn't refuse. The wedding dress wasn't just a gift. It was a declaration of his intentions and a symbol of the trap that was about to close around her forever. Margaret tried on the dress with genuine excitement, spinning in front of the mirror, while Edmund watched with satisfaction that bordered on triumph. She saw herself as beautiful and grown up, ready for whatever adult responsibilities lay ahead. She had no understanding that the dress was meant for a ceremony that would make her Edmund's wife, not in the eyes of God or society, but in the private world he had created where his will was the only law that mattered. The wedding itself was a grotesque parody of a legitimate ceremony, conducted in the private chapel where Edmund still maintained Catherine's preserved body. A minister who owed his living to Edmund's patronage performed the service, though he clearly understood the illegal and immoral nature of what he was doing. The few witnesses were household staff who had been present during Margaret's transformation from child to victim, their silence purchased through years of dependence on Edmund's generosity and fear of his retribution. Margaret spoke her vows with the same careful pronunciation she had been taught for her literature recitations, not understanding that she was legally binding herself to a man who had systematically groomed her for this moment. Edmund's vows were eloquent and seemingly heartfelt, but they were the words of a man who had confused ownership with love, control with devotion. He promised to cherish and protect Margaret, but his definition of protection meant keeping her forever isolated from any influence that might challenge his authority or open her eyes to the true nature of their relationship. The wedding night was a horror that Margaret was completely unprepared for, despite Edmund's careful conditioning. Her education had been deliberately incomplete, leaving her ignorant of physical intimacy while making her compliant and eager to please. What should have been a crime prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law was instead a private violation, witnessed only by the walls of a mansion where money and power had created their own moral universe. In the days following the ceremony, Margaret began to understand that her life had changed in ways she couldn't fully comprehend. Edmund's behavior toward her shifted from paternal guidance to possessive control, and she found herself subject to expectations and demands that confused and frightened her. She was no longer a ward being prepared for eventual independence, but a wife whose entire existence was meant to revolve around her husband's needs and desires. The psychological impact of this transition was devastating, though Margaret lacked the framework to understand what was happening to her. She had been taught that Edmund's approval was the measure of her worth, that his happiness was her primary responsibility, and that questioning his authority was not just inappropriate, but unthinkable. The child who had once run freely through the estate gardens was now a prisoner in silk and jewels, trapped not just by walls and locked doors, but by years of conditioning that made escape seem impossible, even if she had understood the need for it. Edmund's treatment of his child bride combined elements of his previous obsession with Catherine and his newer understanding of how to maintain absolute control. He was simultaneously gentle and threatening, loving and possessive, creating a psychological environment where Margaret never knew whether she was being rewarded or punished for her behavior. This uncertainty kept her in a constant state of anxiety, always trying to please him, while never being sure what might trigger his displeasure. The household staff watched this new phase of Margaret's imprisonment with growing unease, but their complicity in her grooming made them reluctant to seek outside help. They had participated in the systematic isolation of a child, witnessed her transformation into a victim, and now found themselves maintaining the fiction that she was a legitimate wife rather than a prisoner. Their silence was no longer just about preserving their employment. It was about avoiding responsibility for their role in an ongoing crime. As months passed, Margaret's world contracted even further. Edmund's paranoia about losing her led him to implement security measures that would have seemed extreme for an actual prisoner. The windows in her rooms were modified with bars disguised as decorative ironwork. The doors were fitted with locks that could only be opened from the outside. Her movements within the house were monitored constantly, and her access to different areas was restricted based on Edmund's assessment of potential risks to his control. The young woman, who had once been curious about the world beyond the estate, now lived in a bubble so complete that she began to lose touch with reality itself. Edmund controlled not just her physical environment, but her access to information, her understanding of time, and her connection to her own memories. He would contradict her recollections of events, insist that things she remembered clearly had never happened, and gradually convince her that her own perceptions were unreliable. This systematic undermining of Margaret's grip on reality was perhaps the cruelest aspect of her imprisonment. Edmund understood that physical chains could be broken, but psychological bonds were far more durable. By making Margaret doubt her own mind, he ensured that even if she somehow gained access to the outside world, she would be too confused and dependent to seek help or explain her situation coherently. The isolation and manipulation took their toll on Margaret's mental health, though she lacked the vocabulary to understand what was happening to her. She began experiencing periods of depression and anxiety that Edmund dismissed as feminine weakness, requiring his patient guidance. Her attempts to assert any independence or express dissatisfaction with her situation were met with psychological punishment that reinforced her dependence on his approval. As Margaret's 18th birthday approached, Edmund began to contemplate the next phase of his plan. The child he had stolen and shaped was now legally an adult, but she possessed neither the knowledge nor the psychological resources to claim her freedom. She had become exactly what he had envisioned: a beautiful, compliant companion who existed solely for his pleasure and posed no threat to his control. But Edmund's satisfaction with his creation was about to be tested in ways that would reveal the true depths of his madness and the terrible cost of his obsession with absolute power over another human being. The 18th birthday that should have marked Margaret's transition to full adulthood instead became the beginning of an even more sinister phase of her captivity. Edmund had spent years creating the perfect companion, but now he faced a new challenge: ensuring that his creation would remain forever under his control. The legal technicalities that had once protected his guardianship of a minor no longer applied, and Edmund's paranoia about losing Margaret reached new heights of obsession. The solution he devised was as methodical as it was horrifying. Edmund began systematically destroying any evidence that Margaret had ever existed as an independent person. Her birth certificate was removed from public records through bribes paid to corrupt officials. Her baptismal records were altered to show different dates and parentage. Even her parents' graves, for they had both died of suspicious illnesses within months of each other, were relocated to unmarked plots in remote sections of the estate's private cemetery. Margaret herself was told that her parents had written to express their complete satisfaction with her marriage and their decision to emigrate to America, where they could start fresh without the burden of worrying about their daughter's future. Edmund showed her forged letters describing their new life in a distant country, letters that painted a picture of parents who were relieved to be free of responsibility for their child's welfare. The cruelty of this deception was particularly devastating because Margaret had no way to verify these claims or maintain any connection to her origins. The physical modifications to Margaret's living quarters became even more elaborate and restrictive. Edmund hired craftsmen to create what he called improvements to her rooms, but which were actually sophisticated prison cells disguised as luxury accommodations. The walls were lined with silk and adorned with beautiful paintings, but hidden behind the decorative elements were steel reinforcements that made escape impossible. The windows, already barred, were fitted with additional security measures that prevented even the smallest items from being passed through them. Edmund's control over Margaret's daily routine became obsessively detailed. He created elaborate schedules that dictated when she would wake, what she would wear, what she would eat, and how she would spend each hour of her day. These schedules were presented as expressions of his care for her well-being, designed to ensure that she maintained the perfect health and beauty that he so admired. Margaret accepted these restrictions with the compliance of someone who had never known any other way of living. The meals they shared together became increasingly bizarre, theatrical performances, where Edmund would act out conversations with imaginary guests, requiring Margaret to play along with his fantasies about their social life. He would describe elaborate dinner parties they had supposedly hosted, complete with detailed accounts of conversations with influential people who had never actually visited the estate. Margaret learned to participate in these delusions with the same careful attention she had once given to her literature lessons. Edmund's obsession with documenting Margaret's every moment reached pathological proportions. He commissioned artists to create detailed paintings of her engaged in various daily activities, from reading in the garden to playing piano in the music room. These portraits were not meant for public display, but for Edmund's private collection, a visual record of his perfect creation that he could study and admire at his leisure. The artists who created these works were sworn to secrecy and paid enormous sums to ensure their silence about the true nature of their subject. The psychological manipulation that had begun during Margaret's childhood intensified dramatically as Edmund worked to maintain his control over her adult mind. He would create elaborate scenarios designed to test her loyalty and dependence, presenting her with hypothetical situations where she might have to choose between his wishes and her own desires. These exercises were disguised as intellectual discussions about philosophy and morality, but they were actually sophisticated forms of brainwashing designed to reinforce her psychological dependence. Margaret's education, which had once focused on languages and literature, now shifted towards subjects that Edmund believed would make her a more perfect companion. She was taught to massage his temples when he complained of headaches, to prepare his favourite foods according to his exact specifications, and to anticipate his needs before he expressed them. These skills were presented as accomplishments that any refined lady should possess, but they were actually training for a life of absolute servitude. The isolation from the outside world became so complete that Margaret began to lose her sense of time and place. Edmund would deliberately confuse her about dates and seasons, sometimes insisting that months had passed when only days had gone by, or that holidays she remembered celebrating had never actually occurred. This temporal disorientation was another tool in his arsenal of psychological control, making it impossible for Margaret to maintain a coherent sense of her own history or identity. The few servants who remained in the household were carefully selected for their willingness to participate in Edmund's elaborate deceptions. They were required to address Margaret as Lady Blackwood and to treat her as if she were a legitimate member of the nobility, but they were also expected to monitor her behaviour and report any signs of dissatisfaction or rebellion. This created an atmosphere of constant surveillance disguised as respectful service. Edmund's paranoia about potential threats to his control led him to implement security measures that would have seemed extreme for a maximum security prison. The estate's grounds were patrolled by guards who had been told that Margaret suffered from a mental condition that made her dangerous to herself and others. These guards were instructed to prevent her from leaving the immediate vicinity of the house and to report any attempts she might make to communicate with outsiders. The transformation of the estate itself reflected Edmund's determination to create a world where his will was the only law. He had walls built around the entire property, topped with decorative elements that concealed sharp spikes and broken glass. The gates were reinforced and fitted with complex locking mechanisms that required multiple keys to open. What had once been a welcoming country house became a fortress designed to keep its inhabitants imprisoned while maintaining the appearance of a normal aristocratic residence. Margaret's health began to deteriorate under the stress of her imprisonment, though Edmund interpreted her physical symptoms as evidence of her delicate feminine nature rather than signs of psychological trauma. She developed chronic headaches, digestive problems, and a persistent tremor that made simple tasks increasingly difficult. Edmund responded to these symptoms by restricting her activities even further, insisting that she needed more rest and protection from the demands of daily life. The medical care Margaret received was provided by physicians who were either bribed or blackmailed into maintaining Edmund's version of reality. They diagnosed her symptoms as manifestations of feminine hysteria and prescribed treatments that actually worsened her condition while making her more dependent on Edmund's care. The medications they provided were designed to keep her docile and compliant rather than to address the underlying causes of her illness. Edmund's relationship with Margaret took on increasingly disturbing dimensions as he struggled to maintain the fiction that she was his willing wife rather than his prisoner. He would stage elaborate romantic gestures that were actually demonstrations of his power over her, surprising her with gifts that were beautiful, but served to reinforce her dependence. A jeweled necklace became a collar that reminded her of her captivity. A silk gown became a uniform that marked her as his property. The psychological pressure of maintaining her performance as the perfect wife began to take a visible toll on Margaret's mental state. She developed nervous habits like constantly smoothing her dress or checking her appearance in mirrors, behaviors that reflected her desperate need to avoid triggering Edmund's displeasure. Her conversations became increasingly stilted and artificial as she learned to suppress any spontaneous thoughts or reactions that might be interpreted as signs of rebellion. The outside world remained completely unaware of Margaret's situation, partly because Edmund had successfully erased most evidence of her existence, and partly because his wealth and social position made him seemingly beyond suspicion. The few people who might have remembered the groundskeeper's daughter had either died, moved away, or been paid to forget what they had seen. Margaret had become a ghost, a person who existed only within the walls of Edmund's estate and in the twisted reality he had created. As Margaret entered her 20s, Edmund began to contemplate the possibility that his perfect creation might someday die, leaving him alone with his obsession. This fear led him to document every aspect of their relationship in elaborate journals that read like the records of a scientific experiment rather than the expressions of a loving husband. He recorded her daily activities, her responses to different situations, and his own observations about her development under his guidance. The journals revealed the true nature of Edmund's feelings toward Margaret, which had less to do with love than with the satisfaction of absolute control. He wrote about her as if she were a beautiful object he had crafted rather than a human being with her own thoughts and feelings. His descriptions of their interactions focused on her compliance and beauty, rather than any genuine emotional connection or mutual affection. Margaret's own understanding of her situation remained limited by years of conditioning and isolation. She had been taught that her life with Edmund was not just normal, but ideal. A perfect example of how a devoted wife should live. The psychological barriers Edmund had created were so effective that even if she had been given the opportunity to escape, she would have been too confused and dependent to take advantage of it. The estate itself became a character in the ongoing drama of Margaret's imprisonment. The beautiful rooms that had once seemed like paradise now felt like elegant prison cells. The gardens where she had played as a child became exercise yards where she could walk only under supervision. The library that had once been a source of education and entertainment now contained only books that Edmund had selected to reinforce his version of reality. Edmund's control over Margaret's environment extended to the smallest details of her daily existence. He chose her clothing each morning, selected her meals from menus he had approved, and even decided which books she would read and which music she would hear. This micromanagement was presented as loving care, but it was actually a systematic effort to prevent Margaret from developing any independent thoughts or desires. The psychological techniques Edmund employed to maintain his control would have impressed professional interrogators and cult leaders. He used a combination of intermittent reinforcement, isolation, dependency, and reality distortion to create a mental prison that was far more effective than any physical restraint. Margaret learned to anticipate his moods, to suppress her own needs in favor of his desires, and to find her identity entirely through his approval. The transformation of Margaret from a bright, curious child into a compliant, dependent adult represented one of the most successful examples of long-term psychological manipulation in recorded history. Edmund had taken a normal human being and systematically destroyed her sense of self, her connection to reality, and her ability to function independently. The result was a living doll who existed solely for his pleasure and posed no threat to his control. As Margaret's 20s progressed, Edmund began to face the reality that his perfect creation was also mortal. The stress of her imprisonment was taking a physical toll that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Her health problems multiplied, her energy decreased, and her appearance began to show the effects of years spent in psychological captivity. Edmund's response to these changes revealed the true depths of his selfishness and the complete absence of genuine care for Margaret's well-being. The medical treatments Margaret received were designed not to cure her ailments, but to maintain her usefulness to Edmund for as long as possible. She was given medications that masked her symptoms without addressing their underlying causes, subjected to procedures that were meant to preserve her appearance rather than her health, and denied access to treatments that might have helped her recover some measure of independence or clarity. Edmund's journals from this period reveal his growing anxiety about losing his creation to death or deterioration. He began consulting with specialists in preservation and life extension, seeking ways to maintain Margaret's beauty and compliance indefinitely. These consultations led to increasingly bizarre and dangerous experiments that treated Margaret more like a laboratory specimen than a human being in need of genuine medical care. The isolation that had once been a tool for control now became a source of torment for both Margaret and Edmund. The estate had become a tomb where two people existed in a grotesque parody of marriage, cut off from the world and trapped in a relationship that had destroyed them both. Margaret had lost her identity and independence, while Edmund had lost his humanity in his obsession with absolute control. The household staff who witnessed this ongoing tragedy found themselves complicit in a crime that had no clear endpoint. They had participated in the systematic destruction of a human being, and their silence had enabled years of abuse that showed no signs of ending. Their own psychological health began to deteriorate as they struggled with the guilt and horror of what they had helped to create. As Margaret approached her 25th birthday, the full scope of Edmund's crime became clear. He had not just stolen a child or forced an illegal marriage, he had systematically destroyed a human soul and created a living monument to his own twisted desires. The girl who had once run freely through the estate gardens was now a prisoner in silk and jewels, trapped not just by walls and locked doors, but by psychological chains that seemed impossible to break. The story of Margaret Thornfield had become a testament to the destructive power of unchecked wealth and authority, a reminder that the most horrific crimes are often committed in private by those who appear respectable to the outside world. Her imprisonment would continue for decades, hidden behind the walls of a grand estate where money and power had created their own moral universe, far from the reach of justice or compassion. The decades that followed Margaret's 25th birthday blur together in a haze of routine and psychological deterioration that would have driven most observers to madness. Edmund's journals from the 1940s reveal a man whose obsession had evolved into something even more disturbing than his original crime. He had achieved his goal of creating the perfect companion, but perfection, he discovered, was ultimately boring. Margaret's complete compliance, her absolute dependence, her inability to surprise or challenge him, had turned his triumph into a hollow victory. The estate itself began to reflect the stagnation of its inhabitants. Rooms that had once bustled with activity fell into disuse. Gardens that had been meticulously maintained grew wild and overgrown. The staff, aging and dying without replacement, dwindled to a handful of elderly servants who moved through the halls like ghosts themselves. The outside world was changing rapidly, but within the walls of the Blackwood estate, time seemed to have stopped in 1928. Margaret's physical deterioration accelerated as she entered her 30s. The stress of decades spent in psychological captivity had taken a toll that no amount of medical intervention could reverse. Her hair, once lustrous and admired, became thin and brittle. Her skin, despite Edmund's desperate attempts to preserve her beauty, showed the grey pallor of someone who had spent years without genuine sunlight or fresh air. Her eyes, once bright with curiosity and intelligence, had become vacant and distant, reflecting a mind that had retreated so far from reality that return seemed impossible. Edmund's response to Margaret's decline was to double down on his control, rather than acknowledge the damage he had caused. He hired a series of specialists who promised to restore her vitality, subjecting her to experimental treatments that were more torture than medicine. She was given injections of mysterious substances, subjected to electrical therapies, and forced to undergo procedures that were designed to maintain her appearance rather than her health. These interventions only accelerated her decline while adding new layers of trauma to her already shattered psyche. The psychological techniques Edmund employed became increasingly sophisticated as he struggled to maintain his grip on a mind that was slowly slipping away from him. He created elaborate fantasy scenarios where Margaret played different roles, sometimes as his wife, sometimes as his daughter, sometimes as a stranger he was meeting for the first time. These role-playing exercises were designed to keep her engaged and responsive, but they also served to further fragment her sense of identity and connection to reality. The isolation of the estate became so complete that the outside world began to forget that the Blackwood family had ever existed. Edmund's wealth ensured that taxes were paid and legal obligations met, but no one visited, no one called, and no one asked questions about the reclusive lord and his mysterious wife. The few people who remembered Margaret's disappearance had either died or moved away, and the new generation of locals knew only vague stories about the strange goings-on at the old estate. Margaret's attempts to maintain some connection to her original self became increasingly desperate and futile. She would sometimes catch glimpses of her reflection in mirrors and not recognize the woman staring back at her. She would try to remember her parents' faces, her childhood home, the feeling of running freely through the gardens, but these memories had become so overlaid with Edmund's versions of events that she could no longer distinguish between truth and fiction. The servants who remained at the estate found themselves aging into their roles as guardians of a terrible secret. They had watched a child grow into a prisoner, witnessed the systematic destruction of a human being, and participated in a crime that had no statute of limitations. Their own psychological health deteriorated as they struggled with the weight of their complicity, but they were too old, too dependent, and too afraid to seek help or escape their roles as enablers of Edmund's ongoing crime. Edmund's health began to fail as he entered his 60s, but his obsession with maintaining control over Margaret only intensified. He became convinced that she would somehow escape or die if he relaxed his vigilance for even a moment. He installed additional security measures, hired new guards, and created even more elaborate systems of surveillance and control. The estate became a fortress within a fortress, designed to keep Margaret imprisoned, even if Edmund himself was no longer capable of maintaining direct supervision. The medical care Margaret received during this period was provided by physicians who were either too corrupt or too terrified to challenge Edmund's authority. They prescribed medications that kept her docile and compliant while ignoring the underlying causes of her deteriorating health. They documented her symptoms in reports that read like scientific observations rather than medical assessments, treating her as a specimen rather than a patient in need of genuine care. Margaret's connection to language and communication began to deteriorate as she spent more and more time in isolation. She would sometimes speak to herself in fragments of conversations from decades past, mixing memories of her childhood with Edmund's manufactured histories. Her vocabulary shrank as she lost the need to express complex thoughts or emotions, and her ability to form coherent sentences became increasingly limited. The psychological prison Edmund had created was so effective that even when opportunities for escape presented themselves, Margaret was incapable of recognizing or acting upon them. Delivery men who occasionally visited the estate, repair workers who came to maintain the aging infrastructure, and officials who arrived on rare administrative business all failed to notice the signs of her captivity because she had been so thoroughly conditioned to appear normal during these brief encounters. Edmund's journals from the 1950s reveal a man who had begun to question the ultimate purpose of his creation. He had spent decades crafting the perfect companion, but he was forced to confront the reality that his achievement had cost him his humanity and destroyed the very thing he claimed to love. Margaret was no longer the bright, curious child he had stolen, nor was she the compliant wife he had tried to create. She had become something else entirely, a broken shell of a human being who existed only to serve his twisted needs. The estate's isolation from the changing world outside became a source of increasing anxiety for Edmund as he realized that his crime might eventually be discovered. The post-war era had brought new attention to human rights and individual freedoms, concepts that made his treatment of Margaret seem even more monstrous than it had in the 1920s. He began taking steps to ensure that his secret would die with him, creating elaborate plans for Margaret's fate after his death. Margaret's 50th birthday passed without acknowledgement or celebration, another milestone in a life that had been measured not in achievements or relationships, but in years of captivity. She had now spent more of her life as Edmund's prisoner than she had as a free child, and the woman she might have become had been so thoroughly erased that recovery seemed impossible even if rescue had been available. The handful of servants who remained at the estate were themselves elderly and failing, creating a situation where the infrastructure of Margaret's imprisonment was slowly collapsing. Edmund's paranoia about maintaining secrecy conflicted with his need for help in managing both the estate and his increasingly helpless captive. He was forced to rely on fewer and fewer people to maintain the elaborate fiction that had sustained Margaret's captivity for decades. Edmund's death in 1962 should have marked the end of Margaret's imprisonment, but the psychological chains he had forged proved more durable than his physical presence. The woman who had once been a bright, curious child had become so thoroughly conditioned to captivity that freedom was no longer a concept she could comprehend. The few remaining servants, now in their 70s and 80s, continued to maintain the routines that had governed Margaret's life for over 3 decades, partly out of habit and partly because they had no idea how to undo what had been done. Margaret herself seemed almost unaware that her captor had died. She continued to follow the schedules he had imposed, to wear the clothes he had selected, and to live according to the rules he had established. The psychological programming had been so complete that she had become her own jailer, trapped not just by external constraints, but by internal barriers that made escape impossible even when the doors were finally unlocked. The estate began its final decay as the last servants died or became too infirm to maintain their duties. Margaret, now in her 50s, found herself increasingly alone in the crumbling mansion that had been her prison for over 40 years. She moved through the empty rooms like a ghost, maintaining the rituals and routines that had defined her captivity, even though no one remained to enforce them. The discovery of Margaret's situation came not through rescue or investigation, but through the simple passage of time and the inevitable collapse of the systems that had sustained her imprisonment. In 1978, 50 years after her childhood abduction, county officials arrived at the estate to investigate reports of an abandoned property. What they found was a woman in her 60s, living alone in a decaying mansion, with no legal identity, no social connections, and no understanding of the world beyond the walls that had confined her for most of her life. The rescue, when it finally came, was almost as traumatic as the original crime. Margaret had no concept of modern life, no understanding of her rights as a human being, and no ability to function in a world that had changed beyond recognition during her decades of captivity. The bright, curious child who had once run freely through the estate gardens was gone forever, replaced by a broken woman who would spend her remaining years in institutions, surrounded by people who tried to help but could never fully understand the magnitude of what had been done to her. The story of Margaret Thornfield serves as a chilling reminder that the most horrific crimes are often committed in private by those who appear respectable to the outside world. Her decades of captivity, hidden behind the walls of a grand estate where wealth and power had created their own moral universe, represent one of the most complete examples of human destruction ever documented. The child who was stolen became a woman who was lost, and the bright future that should have been hers was sacrificed to feed one man's twisted obsession with absolute control. In the end, Margaret's imprisonment lasted not just decades, but an entire lifetime. Even after her physical rescue, the psychological chains Edmund had forged could never be fully broken. She died in 1987, nearly 60 years after her abduction, having spent only the first 12 years of her life as a truly free human being. Her story remains a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the devastating cost of unchecked power. A reminder that some crimes echo through generations and that some wounds can never fully heal.